Well, no one is going to steal our joy, but this is not the happiest of days around the American Policy Roundtable. I'm Wayne Shepherd here with Dave Zanotti and Rob Walgate and Alan C. Duncan, and our guest we'll introduce in just a moment. Dave, tough day.
Beautiful introduction. Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate that. Because we're not going to talk about how we feel. There's been plenty of that in a year-long campaign. And we're talking about, we're meeting the morning after the November 7th election. I don't think that will be a casual date on the calendar as we look at where American culture is progressing. That we're meeting today after November 7th, after this election. There were a number of things that happened across the nation that were summarized and pontificated upon by the President of the United States last night. A very interesting statement, which we might yet get into, but we want to talk specifically about the question of abortion. And it was focused straight up. It wasn't in a candidate campaign. It wasn't buried in some other matter. It was front and center for the whole world to see and all the media to watch in the state of Ohio. And the abortion forces won handily.
Yeah. And it wasn't part of the abortion issue. It was the whole thing, wasn't it?
It was the whole thing. It was, yeah, they walked away with it. So let me just talk real quickly we want to talk for a few minutes about what happened. And I think it's very important to remember that in Ohio, there are 8 million registered voters. About 2 million people on November 7th voted for Planned Parenthood's amendment. And that we've been hearing that it's enshrining abortion. That word has been from the start to the finish. It's been the banner, the bumper sticker, the tattoo, the identity of this amendment, enshrining abortion. About 2 million people voted. About 1.6 million or so voted against it, and over 4 million people didn't vote at all. So I think that's significant. That puts the issue in perspective as to what percentage of a consensus. 27% of the people of Ohio decided to change the Constitution. Now, they had every right to do so, and they did so, and they won fair and square. All right, so there's no question about that. But 4 million people didn't participate at all. So that kind of puts it in perspective just a little bit. Now, there's a lot of pieces and parts about what happened, but let's go back to Enshrine for just a second. This campaign was designed to get everyone looking at enshrining abortion. And what they didn't tell us until the very last week of the campaign when the reports came out is that George Soros and his international cartel of progressives, including a number of major progressive names in the United States of America, including Arabella Advisors, Governor Pritzker, Michael Bloomberg, the Billionaires Club, they paid for the temple. And they built the steps upon which the shrine was constructed to abortion. They paid the bills. They paid $40 million to build that temple in Ohio. And they put abortion on that as the value that whereby we will identify ourselves in this state. And guess what? They got away with it. They pulled it off. So let's be clear about where the money came from and how it happened. Now, there's more we want to talk about, other pieces and parts. But before we get too much into the weeds, I want to make sure that we've got a sense of balance and perspective, both in the history and the culture. And so we've asked our trustee and our beloved friend, Dr. William B. Allen, to join in this debrief conversation. One, to keep us on the rails, because this happened in a moment, but it's not about the moment. It's about much more than that. So, Dr. Allen, you have been advised on this. You've been watching this. You watched last night. We texted briefly yesterday, and I'm very grateful for everything that you've shared with us. How do you see this?
What I see, David, and thank you, first of all, for gathering to hold this conversation and to take the message more broadly. And I'm so pleased that you began by saying nobody's going to steal joy, because my attitude is to say, Father, we know that you remain in control. And we have no doubt that the ultimate outcome requires of us some participation. We must join with you in these labors. And most spectacularly, we have to begin joining with you by admitting our mistakes. And I say our because I'm talking about the whole country. Ohio is the spotlight. But what happened in Ohio today is taking place nationally. It shares the spotlight with Virginia, which took an awful drubbing for the same reason, because the leadership in the party establishment decided to approach this question of abortion in a non-conventional position. And so now finally we have to understand the need for confessionalism, which begins by confessing our mistakes. And there was a bigger mistake that's been made in this season, stretching back to the Dobbs decision, than the decision that was made to try to impose an absolute ban on abortion. And what people have forgotten is how we got to Dobbs and what the past 50 years have been like. So let me just briefly remind you, if you'll give me a moment to do that.
Please do.
50 years ago with Roe v. Wade, 50 years ago, we were in a position where the states were moving directly to the point that they have now arrived at. That's what was going on. Before the Supreme Court intervened and put a stop to the deliberative process, the movement was in the direction of greatly liberalizing abortion laws. And what did we do? We realized at that time we needed to change the language to address the morality of abortion more squarely. We did that, and that led to Dobbs eventually. Post-Dobbs, we've abandoned the task, the burden of witnessing, and instead we've sought to demand from law what we need to search in the human heart to find. And unless we can get back to the posture of sharing with our fellows the morality of the question as the primary focus, rather than tyrannizing, we're going to continue to suffer these defeats for obvious reasons. The nature of this society is it favors individualism. It favors individual choice. And the only thing that can intervene with individual choice is moral direction. So that is to say, the leadership, I say we speaking very generally now, you might call it the royal we, David. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is the leadership made a very big mistake approaching the question in the way that it did. And it is actually driving the country further in the direction of the embrace of abortion by doing so. And so I think the money from Soros and others is a big deal, but it is not the chief responsibility for what's happening. I think the chief responsibility lies on the shoulders of the pro-life leadership and conservative leadership in the Republican Party, which haven't understood its role as problem solvers, which means bringing people together, which means giving witness instead of simply reaching for the nearest law with which to bludgeon people. That's the mistake. It is going to continue to destroy us unless we change.
Doc, I can tell you that Rob Walgate is twitching here because this brings us back to where we started a year ago in Ohio at the state capitol. Mm-hmm. And what we encountered among all the media in the state capitol, State House, the Nationals, all of them, the locals, was a sense of morbid hostility to the behavior of the Republican legislature, which had a supermajority and was basically treating people, I would say, pretty poorly.
Yeah, poorly in the fact that I don't feel like they study history and realize there's ebbs and flows and peaks and valleys. And eventually, the people with the letters next to their name that have the same letters as they do won't be in charge. It changes.
Well, and I'm going to say something on the confessional zone. Look, we've been on radio every day since 1989, and we're often defined as one of the talk radio sources in this country. We have a lot of people in Republican seats in the legislature who are kind of like they're candidates that were birthed out of talk radio, so to speak. They have all the glib answers and know how to call certain people all the right names, but I don't know that they've ever cracked a book and studied the fundamental realities of what does it mean to live in an environment where the consent of the governed is the essential dynamic upon which we base our laws. If you cannot build consent, you cannot govern. And if you have a supermajority and you abuse that supermajority by defying the concept of consent of the governed, people are going to find a way to kick your tail. And that, I mean, the hostility in the statewide and national media in Ohio toward that Republican General Assembly isn't just because they're pro-life. Mike DeWine's pro-life, and they don't hate him because Mike DeWine understands you've got to listen to people. Now, he didn't do a very good job of that during COVID. You know, he's not suddenly my new best friend. All right, we've been friends for a long time. But he was wrong about COVID, and he got his tail kicked also when he went that far. You've got to find a way. And people misunderstand this, Doc. They think, well, now Zanotti's gone woke. No, you've. I've gone constitutional. I've gone Declaration of Independence. Heaven forbid, I've gone biblical. Where does the Bible tell us when you get into a position of majority that you're to use compulsion to beat your neighbor into submission?
Yeah.
Am I close on that?
You're exactly right. And that's what I'm talking about. That's why I say we must begin by confessing a mistake. And that is the precise mistake. We're doing exactly what the extremist progressives are doing, relying on the force of law to direct human conduct rather than relying on the human heart. Now that's a big mistake.
I'm going to pause right there and break in because we do need to take a break, but we will continue this important conversation on the heels of November 7 on the Public Square today. You can listen to this broadcast online, of course, at thepublicsquare.com. Use our smartphone app to listen as well. It's an important debrief here today. We urge you to stay tuned with us.
We will be right back for more on the Public Square.
Back with you on the Public Square today as our panel is joined by Dr. William B. Allen. And we gather on the morning after the November 7th election in Ohio, where voters voted to amend the Ohio Constitution to allow abortion. Dave?
Now, Doc, some people are going to say, well, wait a second. Are you saying we don't want laws? We don't need laws? Doesn't matter what the laws say regarding abortion? I mean, I thought we were supposed to participate in the process. They might think that, are we abandoning the concept of participation in lawmaking?
Laws without foundations are not laws. Laws that invite disobedience are not laws. Making laws requires working with human beings. That's why I started out by saying you have to address the human heart on these fundamental moral questions. Sure, it's fine to write laws regulating street traffic and automobiles. Why? Because that doesn't require a moral judgment. It requires simply a prudent regard for one's own safety. But beyond that, we have to ask what it is we're asking people to do. And we're asking them to say yes or no to, especially when we're pointing a gun at their heads. Because people have a peculiar reaction to guns pointed at their head. Yes, duck and hide, that's one reaction. Another reaction is simply to be very angry and even hostile, that anyone would put me in the position of coercion with respect to something that is fundamentally a decision I must take. So you need to be able to bring people together in a conversation around the question of how do we cooperate to frame laws such that they support people rather than repress people. That becomes the question.
Now, let me take this up another level, because right now I've likened this to a scene from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in which the winter false queen of Narnia feels that she has the final drop on Aslan and all that's good, and that evil is about to triumph. And it was quite a moment, and there was quite a hysteria of tortured joy when they thought they had finally killed Aslan. We've watched the performance of the anti-life community, and I use that term because I've reached the conclusion that because of our quest for human autonomy and culture, that there is a sentiment here, and I think anti-life is the wrong thing. I think it's almost better, I would call it the non-life community. They no longer care about the question of protecting innocent human life. They simply care about rejoicing in their own autonomy to say to someone, you can't tell me what to do. It's almost like a massive
Yes.
adolescent temper tantrum at the cost of human lives.
That's exactly my point. That's exactly what's going on with this. Yes, there are people out there who are squarely, fundamentally anti-life, who are dogmatically in favor of abortion. But the vast number of them are not in that position. They're in the position of saying, you're not the boss of me, as all our children start life saying.
There it is.
And these people are grown-up children saying, you're not the boss of me.
There it is.
And why it was leadership would place people in that position is incomprehensible.
So in Ohio, it was further amplified. Rob, you witnessed it. You and Melanie both at the state legislature. You witnessed the bullying of the supermajority.
We did. And as I hear Dr. Allen talk and speak about that, I'm also reminded that it's our responsibility to dig a little deeper because we're distracted by whatever the headline is, or we're distracted by the 30-second commercial. We don't take the time as Americans to understand what our decisions will actually do, because many times it's far more complicated than maybe the headline tells us.
Well, and it's amplified when we get into the question of donor funding and sources, because now you have people who are trying to prove they're the purest kid on the block, therefore give us all your pro-life money. And so we had a situation in Ohio that was amplified by this and by the importation of lots of money. Now, Soros spent $40 million, and Soros and company. Let me be careful. Let me make sure that's, I made the mistake. I'm correcting the mistake. Soros and company in the Billionaires Club. But the pro-life forces way back in April, before this thing was anywhere close to being on the ballot, spent $5 million running their first commercial ad on the language that was being presented. Now, you say, what? Wait a minute, what? Yeah, here's what happened. The pro-life national forces decided the smart way to beat this amendment in Ohio was to pass a 60% supermajority law, because Ohio is a ballot and initiative state, and the citizens have the right to bring things. They knew that the pro-aborts were going to make it to the ballot. And so they said, let's intersect them. And so they used their supermajority. They bullied the legislature into passing a law that they had just passed a law. This is so dumb. It's hard to even say it. A year ago, they said no more August elections, no more special August elections. Nobody shows up and it costs the state $20 million. It's the wrong thing to do. So the Republican supermajority said—
Taking deep breaths so I don't jump in
no
here
more
because—
August elections. Then when it looked like the pro-aborts were going to make it to the November ballot, they said, oh, wait. We were just kidding. Let's strike that law and pass a special August election for a supermajority ballot, because that will head them off at the pass, like an old Western. We'll head them off at the pass, flip the numbers to 60% supermajority, and probably beat them that way.
Well, and the thing about it, with what the Republicans did in Ohio in terms of the August election, you would think they would say, you know what, we made a mistake. We passed a law that says no August elections. We were wrong. August elections are important. This is an example on why they're important. But they didn't do that. They doubled down. They basically said, August elections are only important when we want to hold August elections.
Right.
If you want to hold one in your local community, it's not important. These are the only ones that are important. So they took that holier-than-thou approach, talking down to people, and people around the state are looking around saying, they're doing what?
And that holier-than-thou approach infected all across the pro-life community. We looked at this because we've got more experience on ballot issues than all the other folks in the pro-life movement combined with 43 years, and we looked at it from a pure perspective of, is this the way law is supposed to be altered and changed? Is this right? Is this principled? And we said, this doesn't make sense. So we went to them behind the scenes and explained to them the polling data that we have known about for quite some time that showed if the legislature did this, it was doomed to fail. The people of Ohio would reject it because the people of Ohio hold on to their ballot initiative rights very dearly. They participate in that process, and they felt like someone was sneaking something away from them to make them make another decision, or to force them, or to be the boss of them. It was a terrible situation. They blew right past that warning, that series of warnings, And they went on to spend another $18 million on an August election that they lost 57-43. They split the pro-life community. They confused the living daylights out of everybody. And then when they turned around and looked at the fact that 90 days later, what was staring them in the face? But the Soros cartel and a $40 million avalanche of money about to bury them. They set themselves up to fail. Now, we're getting emails, even to this moment, blaming us because we didn't support the 60% supermajority. I want to make it very clear to everyone in America, and we're not backing down on this 1 inch. Soros Company and Planned Parenthood got 57% of the vote in Ohio on November 7th. If they needed 3% more, they would have bought that too. There's no way you're going to stop these people when you're using compulsion and trickery, because the people are going to be exactly what Dr. Allen said. Quit trying to be the boss of me. I don't care what the issue is. Pox on your house.
Yes, and you can't get away from it. It is absolutely critical to, and that's why I said we need to be confessional right now. And I don't mean that simply in the religious sense. I mean, we need to confess our mistakes. We need to confess our errors. We need to repent, for heaven's sakes. Let's just be very blunt about this. We have not been good stewards. We have not been faithful to the gospel. We have not undertaken the work of cooperating, coordinating, and working with people, as you said earlier, listening to them and seeking to engage their hearts. We have failed. We have not been sentries on, the watchman watches in vain under certain circumstances. That's what we have been doing. And it's time to stop leaving aside, and I'm not talking about Soros and what you're saying, but we're talking about the pro-life community. It's time to stop naming enemies and start admitting failures.
Alan?
So August issue 1 went down 57-43. This one also went down 57-43. What do we make of that? Is that the same people voting the same way? Did they lump them together? How do we figure that out?
Well, actually, the turnout was bigger, about 600,000 votes bigger in this time, which should have played well for the pro-life community. But in essence, I really believe that the spirit defined by Dr. Allen of "you're not the boss of me" was the prevailing factor. Now, there was another factor that came in dynamically, and this is another confessional moment. We said from the beginning, the first time we saw the Beth and Kyle commercial, where the pro-aborts went ahead and found a couple to use as the new Norma McCorvey, the victimized people who the Ohio laws put them in a terrible position, and it's all those evil Republicans' fault. They trumped up that commercial to the nth degree. Now, we fact-checked that commercial ourselves. We had all the facts regarding the fabrications of that commercial. And we went behind closed doors off the record to reporters and said, have you looked at this? Have you considered this? Have you made these phone calls? Have you asked this person? Across the board, none of them ever did. They refused to fact check the single most dynamic commercial that was driving the election. They were all in the tank. And no one would fact check that commercial. And the pro-life leadership of this campaign never took on that commercial themselves. They never touched it. And that controlled the entire debate.
Well, no shallow conversation today in the public square, as always, and we sure appreciate you listening as we try to figure out what happened here and what we can do next time. So stay with us. The Public Square continues. Our guest, Dr. William B. Allen. Back with you in the public square now. We're so privileged to have our trustee, Dr. Allen, with us today. Dr. Allen, anything you'd like to add to what we've talked about so far?
Let me add this much, which I think is really critically important for us. The work is not over. We still have the babies to care about. It's about the babies.
Wow.
And it's necessary to convey that message. It's not about a political loss or a political victory. It's about the babies. And therefore, we cannot give up. We know that the society is trending in a certain direction. The burden is on us to lead it back from that direction. The burden of political leadership to lead its membership in its respective parties away from disastrous, self-feeding postures. One of the great difficulties that happened in the state of Virginia is, as wonderful as Governor Youngkin is in so many respects, in the powerful campaign he was running this season, he did not rein in the constant flooding of the airways with the most radical positions on the question of abortion from his own party. And it alienated voters in Virginia. Political leadership has the responsibility to lead people away from their own self-inflicted disasters. That is their chief job. It is not enough simply to take a position and to repeat slogans. You've got to give people the source they need to be prudent, to exercise judicious judgment, and to care for their fellows.
You know, as we saw election night play out, and we've seen some of the reporting over the past month when it comes to campaign finance, one of the things that's interesting to me is for so many years, conservatives or people that would be labeled on the right were always portrayed as the bad guys because of the big money that was spent. Look at all the money. When you look at the amount of money that was spent, whether you talk about the Virginia state legislature races, whether you talk about the Pennsylvania Supreme Court race, whether you talk about the gubernatorial race in Kentucky, whether you talk about the ballot issues in Ohio, it was dominated by the left. The money was dominated by the left. All of a sudden, you're not hearing that scream anymore. Hey, we need to get money out of politics. Not when George Soros has the checkbook open.
And his friends.
And his friends.
Yeah. I mean, listen, there's plenty of blame to go around on that one. And it's a matter of public record. This is not jumping into some talk show host blackboard and coming up with a conspiracy. This is in plain sight and it's fully documented. So we're not making this stuff up.
You're also very right about that, but I'm going to remind you of something. Nelson Rockefeller never could buy the presidency.
That's another one of those boom moments when you're taking notes and Dr. Allen just blows your mind right there. And for those of you who don't know who Nelson Rockefeller is, look him up. You'll find this is a very interesting point.
Lessons to be learned.
Some people are going to ask, well, you guys just sound like a bunch of sore losers. All right. Well, first off, those are fighting words if you're talking about our friend Dr. William B. Allen, because this man's been through more battles and is immune from any such cavalier judgment. But okay, I'll accept that and take that. No, I'm not a sore loser because you know what? The battle is far, 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 far from over. And there is no backing down because our call in faith, and and I'll say this, first, our call in faith is to care about what Christ Jesus cares about, what the Creator cares about. Our call as Americans is to the Declaration of Independence, which acknowledges that self-same Creator and describes the reality that we are here because of the right to life that God placed in the human being. We didn't choose to be here. We came here as a gift from God. And that the protection of human life, the right to life, is the first right. As Dr. Allen has taught us, that's the first right. And none of the other rights make any sense at all if you don't have that one right. So this is an American discussion as well. It is a political discussion, yes, but it is much, much more than a political discussion. It is a matter of life and death because if you take all the politics out of it, adopt a purely Darwinian point of view and ask yourself, how are we doing with depopulation in the United States of America? What you will find is that by enshrining a temple to abortion, by building an altar upon which you place abortion, and on that altar sacrificing innocent human life, you are literally beginning to make yourselves extinct. And that is what's happening in America in regards to our population rate.
And you're also building idol worship. Remember, it is the sacrifice of children, most of all, that characterize the age of idol worship.
Yes. But I do have to ask you, aren't our hands tied in Ohio now? This is a constitutional amendment. What do we do about that, Dave?
Great question, Wayne. And of course, no, because one group can put something up for vote on the Constitution and so can another. And so that's why on election night, we called immediately for the General Assembly of Ohio, not by coercion and not by bullying people, but to hold a hearing and ask the question, now that the people, a majority, 2 million of the people have spoken and they won fair and square, how will what they've just put on the ballot intersect with at least 50 laws that are currently on the books? Because that's kind of a train wreck in slow motion, and we better do some research on that in a hurry.
Well, and on the public square last week, we had Larry Obhoff, former president of the Ohio Senate. He and I have talked frequently over the past few days, and that, he talked about it being a collision course in the courts. That's about what's to happen as it pertains to those laws. There's a lot of unanswered questions. But one thing remains constant that we've talked about at the American Policy Roundtable, and that's that we feel that constitutional amendments should only be proposed in the fall of even-numbered years. Because like you discussed earlier, we talk about 3.6, 3.8 are going to weigh in on issue 1 in 2023 in Ohio. And next year, when it's a presidential election,
could be 5 million or more.
It could be 4.6 to 5.2. We don't. Yes.
Right.
So you're going to have at least 1 million more people weigh in.
Which is not to say because we got more people than you know. It's because you want to create the broadest possible consensus. It's the governance of our Constitution, and we're all responsible for that. But Wayne, in addition to that, yes, we also called for the legislature to put what we would call a replace and repeal measure on. Because when they do their research and when they do their homework, they're going to discover that this is a train wreck, that not only is it going to intersect with 50 laws and upend them, but it's going to create endless litigation in our court system. It's going to be Roe versus Wade on steroids. And so the question is simply this: the legislature, upon that research, would have the ability to say, this is a more reasonable approach. Meet with people and find out the questions why, and then establish an approach which they believe represents consensus, and then place that on the ballot. Of course it will be opposed by the very same people again. Of course it will be opposed. But now the shoe's on the other foot. And it would bring us back to a place where we should have been in the first place. The pro-life community could have gone on the offensive in a consensus perspective, but they waited and got caught on defense. And what Planned Parenthood did in Ohio is to reach for the super ultimate goal of what they want. Now, that's Ohio. We can also talk about Florida, because we've studied the Florida amendment, and we will be bringing all of this research to Florida today, starting today. Because in Florida, you'll find they only have a 1-sentence amendment that's going to be placed on the ballot in 2024, because they're doing exactly what Dr. Allen said should be done. In Florida, they've whittled this thing down into the most innocuous language of 1 sentence. Now, it gives you about 50% of what they took in Ohio in regards to transferring power to Planned Parenthood and their best friends. And it will, in fact, create unlimited abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy in the same mechanisms. But it gives the legislature a recognized constitutional authority to still deal on an issue like parental consent. It's very carefully worded. It's moderated to get the 60% supermajority, because that's what they need.
I was going to say, what percentage do they need in Florida?
60%.
And they're still coming after it.
And so they put together a very clever piece. All right. Now, we have to unpeel that for people to see how radical it is in the midst of its cleverness. But see, they're going, and so we have to learn how to do this the right way.
All right, we'll pick up this thread of conversation coming up in a moment on the Public Square. We do need to take a break. And again, if you joined us late, you must go back and listen to the beginning of this program. I really highly recommend that. You can do that online easily at thepublicsquare.com, or use the smartphone app to download and take the program with you to listen to at your convenience. The Public Square in your app store.
If you're a regular listener to The Public Square, you've heard of the release of the new book, Jesus, His Story. The response has been remarkable. Why the excitement? This is a sample of what readers are saying. Arranging the 4 Gospels into chronological order put the life of Jesus into perspective. Thank you. One told us, after reading Jesus' story, I knew this would make a great graduation gift for my nephew. Another said, I got my copy of Jesus' story and read it over the weekend. I want to order 6 more. Can't wait to give them to my friends and family. Interested? You can call us at 1-800-522-8683 or order online. Take a fresh look at the greatest story ever told, Jesus, His Story, at thepublicsquare.com.
In studio today on the Public Square, Dave Zanotti, Rob Walgate, Alan C. Duncan. I'm Wayne Shepherd, and our guest, of course, is our very special friend and trustee of the American Policy Roundtable, Dr. William B. Allen. Dr. Allen, just before we went to that break, I sensed you were about to say something, and I may have cut you off there. I apologize.
No apology necessary. I was just going to remind everyone of the Articles of Confederation, ratified 1781, replaced by the Constitution 1787, 6 years later. I.e., this is not the end of a constitutional conversation. It's the beginning of a constitutional conversation. Nothing stands in the way of continuing constitutional conversation because that's part of public education. So yes, they passed it, and now they must answer for it. And now people must bring forth the considerations that would lead to an improvement because it will be unworkable.
It will be unworkable. We consider that another word. It is unsustainable because it is a complete one-dimensional strategy in regards to a constitutional amendment. So in essence, what happened was the bullying and the "you're not the boss of me" reaction enabled the pro-abortion community to go just that far in the opposite direction in the pendulum. Now, what's intriguing is I would wager if we and we can't because Rob's here and we're not supposed to, so we're not going to wager.
Now we're getting into a 2009 constitutional amendment.
If we had a fund of $100,000 right here, and we could give every journalist that wrote on this story $1,000 if they could answer 5 basic questions about this amendment, what it is and what it means, I'll guarantee you we'd still have the fund left over when we were done. But in addition to that, if we were able to survey the voters of the 2 million people who voted yes on this, I'll guarantee you they did not know what they voted on and the consequences. They just didn't know. They did what they were told.
I want to correct them partially.
Please.
They did know what they were voting on, but they were wrong. Let's face it. There were women there who were voting to say, I'm not a witch because I had an abortion or I might have an abortion. And frankly, it's time for the pro-life forces to say, you're not a witch because you had an abortion. That's the bridge we've got to cross.
You know, one of the articles I read last night, and it's one of those deals where you're reading something and then you X out of it and you're like, what was I reading? Looking through the history to find it. But one of the articles talked about, a member of the media was saying, well, the proposed constitutional amendment doesn't say what the no people are saying it says because we went to the author, one of the authors, and we asked them, and it was a
what?
It was a doc, and that's why I hated to bring it up because I'm like, how did I miss this article and where did I find this tweet? And
I've seen that article.
Yeah,
I know.
And I was like, wait a minute. So they're saying, they're saying we're going to ask you what you meant by this, even though the words don't match up with what you say.
We must have been around the same place at the same hour in the middle of the morning because I looked at my wife and I said, let's think about this a second. 2 million people just voted yes on an amendment that no one knows who wrote. We don't know who wrote this. To this day, we don't know who wrote it. We asked every journalist we could talk to say, could you find out who wrote it? Could you fact check the origin of the piece? And they all said, oh, well, it was lawyers for Planned Parenthood or lawyers for the ACLU. Well, I get all that. Can we talk to them? Can we actually ask them what they meant with these words? And so here's the question. When all of these things come to court and people ask, okay, who wrote this thing? Do you realize that where will when this enters into the evidentiary trail of a trial, who will they call to say, let's bring the author in to find out what the author meant? Irrelevant. That's how we amend our Constitution?
Yeah, that's wonderfully observed. Just remember that when the Constitution went out, it had the signatures of everybody who voted for it.
Okay, so where do we go from here? I think that what we're hearing in this broadcast, and I urge everyone to go back and revisit, is a sense of repentance and confession And not just strategic confession, not just strategic redeployment, not just, oh, if we could match their money, we could win. No, this I would say that this issue, Doc, is a symbol of the entire spirit of autonomy that's raging right now in our culture. And we're not having a conversation with anybody. We're just having shouting matches.
You're right on top of it. We have isolated ourselves one from another, hiding behind a veneer of complete self-sufficiency.
And I would propose that it is immoral for the right to try to manipulate the shouting match as it is for the left to manipulate the shouting match. Am I close there?
Exactly. That is my point.
Now, the problem with that is that so many people in the pro-life community, in the conservative community, are trained to instantly react as soon as someone gets outside the common language. And as soon as someone stops calling names and decides to sit down with a person as a human being. As soon as we start talking about how do we build consensus toward the common good versus how can my side win and stop you, I want to remind people of this. And look, this is a discovery for me. I'm not trying to in any way present anything in this broadcast that says any of us are smarter than anybody else. Now, Dr. Allen is, but that's another question, okay? The point is, we have to get to the place of understanding that you cannot govern outside consensus. You cannot govern outside consent, and that is a biblical principle. It flows from 1 Samuel chapter 8. It flows from the Mosaic covenant. The God of the Bible is a God of consent. Doc, I was thinking of you when I was reading 2 Corinthians chapter 4, when Paul says, we appeal to all men's conscience.
Yes.
Isn't that what we're called to do? To bring out the moral equation of the new life and ask people to consider it. Now, they're not always going to. Sometimes they're going to trash it, walk away and say, you guys are morons, that you're not the boss of me, no matter what. We're not going to win them by public relations campaigns. And we may not be able to win them at all for a while. But ultimately, the Tower of Babel always falls, right? And somebody wakes up.
Yes. And we must remember talking points are not arguments for which we are willing to be held accountable. As good of an argument is, it opens you to investigation. Talking points close you off from investigation.
People are afraid of this kind of conversation, Doc. They just want to win. They just want one side to beat the other side, and they want their side to be the winning side.
Don't you think it's really foolish for people to be motivated by the desire to win when they constantly lose?
Well, Wayne, I think we're at time for a break. Let's just think about that one as we go into the break.
I think we need to put that one on the wall. I really do. All right. Well, Dr. Allen will continue with this. We have one final segment coming up in a moment, but some of you, your stations are leaving us now. If that's the case, of course, to hear the rest of this conversation, go online to thepublicsquare.com.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the public square.
For a final few minutes on the public square today, this is being recorded the day after the November 7th election in Ohio, in which abortion was, to use other people's terms, enshrined in the Ohio Constitution. Dave, you mentioned Florida earlier. I'm just wondering if we could highlight the lessons that we've learned in this battle for people around the country who are going to face this where they live.
Yeah, and right from the start, I've got to tell you, Wayne, there are lessons that if the people in Florida, Arizona, New York, if we don't all get a lot wiser in this situation, we're going to see a lot more losses. I think Dr. Allen has rightly summarized. So I would say the first thing is let's listen to what was just said. And you don't have to like the personalities. You don't have to like necessarily each term that was chosen. But I would beg people, particularly people who are pro-life, to consider this conversation carefully. Consider the ideas that are being presented, the suggestions, and the spirit in which they're being presented. You cannot govern people outside of consent. Now, one of the lessons is to understand that the people that are doing this, that are writing these amendments, are brilliant. They are very clever at exploiting the current climate in culture. And the Florida amendment that's coming up, for example, is brilliantly crafted to get a massive amount of change in the direction of expanding abortion funding, and everything that the pro-abort community wants. But it's only a sentence. It's multiple times smarter than the Ohio piece. But you see, now it's easy to say, well, you can get 60%. This isn't anywhere near as radical as what happened in Ohio. They're so clever in how they manipulate these processes. Mm-hmm. So the first thing is read. The second thing is I would suggest that it is vitally important that we keep campaigns focused on the language and the consequences in real life experiences. Show all sides. Yes, it does this, but did you consider that it does that? And to be responsible about the rhetoric of what the language does and doesn't do. Now, we're going to face huge opposition, and this would be the next lesson. The organized media, the paid media, the commercial media in America is in the tank on this question. They will not be the source by which our objectivity will be manifested into the culture. We have to do that through all of our individual efforts in media. Programs like the Public Square in Florida, there are many networks of radio stations that people can listen to that are not owned by giant corporations, and there are many other media outlet, and we can do things on YouTube independent of. We can do things across paid advertising. We have to make our own media. We must reach people more effectively than the medium that is out there, and we must begin to do it now. And we must understand it doesn't matter if you think you've got a national TV buy. They're going to outbuy you 10 times. We have to work grassroots from the bottom up and use every media technique at our disposal, and we have to fund that.
Yeah. Rob, you've worked so hard on this issue. What would you say about wisdom to pass along to others?
Oh, wisdom is you have to start from the beginning, the things that we've learned. As Dave said, the funding to do it and the ability to speak the truth and have the tough conversations. I'm reminded of the conversation I had on election night on radio where a caller was talking about things that happened around the country. And I started pressing a little bit like, well, tell me about this in Kansas or tell me about this in Michigan. Their response was, well, I don't want to get in the weeds and the details of that. And I'm like, well, the weeds and the details is where it lives. That's what's important about it. We have to understand those details when we're talking about our state constitutions, when we're talking about those things. It's not as simple as a 30-second commercial or as a headline. And I think it's important for us to talk with those media folks that are out there, the people that are in Florida, Arizona, and New York. Ask the tough questions of those media folks. We did in Ohio. We tried in Ohio, and we would try again.
Well, let me say another thing about what to pass on to every other state. I have to tell you that in 50 years, 43 years actually, we've never seen as many churches participate favorably working toward the question of voting for life as we have in the Ohio campaign. And like we've tried to explain to the pro-life and pro-family forces since the early 80s, that's wonderful, but it's not enough. Mm-hmm. There's this idea if all the church folk just showed up and voted the right way, we'd win every time. Number one, there's not enough of them if they did. Number two, they don't. And number three, they won't. In every congregation, you don't have 100% participation nor 100% unanimity. We must reach the people who are thoughtful, who want to do the right thing, and persuade them by the grace and the wisdom of what's being presented. We may win, we may lose, but if we start just thinking we've got bigger numbers than you and we'll get our numbers, therefore we don't have to talk to anybody else, we'll win it on the base, They just got hammered twice in Ohio, and we'll lose again in Florida. I mean, and Doc, you're in Florida right now. You know we have the Florida office, and we do a lot of work in Florida with the Florida Policy Roundtable. Does that part make sense for what you see in Florida?
Certainly. And as I said, it's really a national question at this stage. I realize we have to make decisions step by step, but we're in the midst of a national move that's going to shape each of the individual states in the country as a whole.
I also think we have to look at the education of our young people from a church perspective. The church as a whole largely has turned over the education of young people to a school system that doesn't align with the worldview. And if we think that the 60 minutes you're taking your child to Sunday school on Sunday morning or your grandchild to Sunday school on Sunday morning is going to override what they're being taught the other 5 days of the week.
This commercial message brought to you by Melanie Elsey. She would have Melanie, if she had been here this morning, she would have exactly said that. Doc, let me ask you another question. We've just got a couple of minutes left. Let's look at the national perspective now. You're bringing us to the national conversation. My guess is there's a lot of Republican consultants right now that are telling conservative candidates, see, we told you so. Do not touch abortion because it's the wrong season. It's going to go its own way. Find something else to talk about because this is a losing issue. Leave it alone. What do you think about that?
From my perspective, that is excessive, but it is important to speak about abortion reasonably. For example, in Ohio now, though, it's really important to turn your attention to the next phase because this has passed a constitutional amendment, and it's an almost certain result that it's going to require public funding of abortions. So you might as well start talking about it.
And in fact, the way this particular amendment in Ohio is constructed, if someone were to work against funding toward Planned Parenthood and their entities, since they literally wrote their business plan into, I can't say literally, since they just about literally wrote their business plan into the Constitution, and also then a prohibition at anyone that tries to get in their way, this is exactly where the railroad tracks are going.
Yes.
And it's also a place where we talked about people will be in the courts regarding parental consent and the other 50 statutes that will be thrown on their head because of this. This may be a place where Planned Parenthood goes to the courts as well and says, wait a minute, these are constitutional rights that need funded. You have a responsibility as the state legislature to provide funding for this constitutional right.
Because they're creating a right. Now, the Florida piece is very clever. It does not create a right. It speaks only about constitutional prohibitions and regulations. But the Ohio one, that's the one they wanted. That was the big one. Wayne.
Yeah.
Well, we're down to the wire here. Any final word on this here, the day as we have this conversation, the day following November 7?
Doc, take the final word and speak to the people who are saying, I've given up hope. I mean, I had one person write me today and basically said, the Holy Ghost has left the building.
You bring to mind, of course, that when the temple was first constructed out in the desert, the Lord said, well, when you see the cloud, when you see my presence there, tell them to stay away. Because if they get too close, they might get scorched. So you remind me of that, of course. You say they enshrined it. They built the temple. But the question is, who dwells there?
Wow. And that will be the final word today. Powerful. Thank you, Dr. Allen, and thanks to everyone who participated today in the Public Square, and we'll see you next time.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.